Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I can imagine you are overwhelmed with all the information. So I hope that at the end of my talk, you remember that's a two-step model on harmonized principles with a basic level and an expanded level, and with good regulatory practices needed for an effective and efficient implementation. So that's all you need to remember when you go, and the rest is just around that. This is the content of my presentation. I talked briefly about the commonalities and differences between medicinal products, which are medicines and medical devices, the current status of regulatory system on medical devices, with one slide on the MO region, why regulating medical devices, and the two-step model. When talking medical products, there are two major groups, medicines and medical devices. And if you look at the definition, there's a large extent in common, and especially since it's the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of disease. Although for medical devices, there's a huge group of assistive devices, which are usually not for the treatment, but for the support of people with functioning problems. But that's a huge group. Where they differ is in the mode of action. The mode of action of a medical device is not pharmacological, immunological, or physiological. But there are, of course, the gray areas, like dialyzing solution. Is it yes or no a medical device? That's one of the borderline products which we face in day-to-day practice. This is a list, only a short list of the differences and commonalities. There are many more. If you look at the regulatory framework, most countries, I could say all countries, regulate medicines. According to our information, 57% of the countries of the member states, 194 of WHO, regulate medical devices. On the medical devices, we have hundreds of thousands of products on the market. We estimate at least 500,000, but it could well be 1.5 million. For medicines, if you look at US FDA and Europe, they license approximately 40 new molecular entities per year, which is in fact a very limited number. So for medicines, an individual assessment can be done, which can't be done, of course, for medical devices. And there's a risk-based approach there, the class A, B, C, D, and so on, because it's just not doable. The nomenclature. You can imagine, and I know there are pharmacy people in the room, a world where we wouldn't talk paracetamol or simvastatin or paroxetine in the same way all over the world, that we would have different nomenclature systems for medicines. You can't imagine a world like that. We have that in medical devices. I listed a few of the nomenclature systems, but there are also nationally developed systems, which is in fact a huge hurdle in exchange of information. Then the industry composition. Well, if you look at pharma, there's big pharma, and they are merging all the time, so there's hardly any place for small and medium enterprises. That's not the case for medical devices. There's a huge amount of small and medium enterprises in the world. And so the sales for pharma is about 900 billion US dollars, and we estimate, but probably it's much more, 500. So it's a significant number of dollars, which is the medical devices world. On the global trends in medical devices regulation, 57%, so 110 countries regulate. 29%, 57 of the 194 member states say we don't regulate, and the rest we don't have any information. We tried through country offices, through direct contacting for the information, but we couldn't obtain. If you look to the regulatory status according to income group, well, you can see that the low-income countries regulate less than the high-income countries. The high-income countries approximately 80%, and low-income countries about 30%. And this is the picture according to the WHO regions. And if we have to focus our efforts, you can imagine that the focus will be on Afro, AMRO is working on it, and WIPRO. This is what we know from the EMRO region. So there are 21 countries, and other than the global picture, the spread in non-regulating and regulating is also in the high-income countries about 50%. That's unlike the global picture, where 80% of the high-income countries regulate. So why regulating medical devices? No one would argue that a patient shouldn't have access to safe and effective medical devices. There's also an increasing importance of medical devices. There's no medical intervention possible, I could say, without a medical device. And they have a huge turnover. People say there's a commercial life cycle of 1.5 years, and with the amount of products on the market, you can imagine it's very dynamic. So there is a need for some regulation. We live in a globalizing world, and that means most countries in the world, not only low and middle income countries, but also high income countries, are importing countries. They don't have oversight of the manufacturer somewhere in the world. The manufacturer may not be the licensing country. So it's a huge globalized world, and if we want to have oversight, we should regulate and we should harmonize. Member states are asking for support, and as we have seen, member states lack regulatory system. So the WHO, the World Health Assembly regulation of 2014 states a lot, but this on medical devices. So there is a focus on medical devices because it hasn't been regulated properly, you could say. So WHO started working, and this is the working group, most of them. And you see some familiar faces. And that's important because although we are presenting different models, the basics are the same. But what are the challenges we are facing? Well, vaccines and medicines are far ahead in terms of regulation and regulatory systems. So there are agencies, there are well-established systems, and we know even all the pharmacovigilance. There is a worldwide pharmacovigilance network. And from medical devices, we are kind of jealous there because we don't have that Uppsala center and we don't have the evaluation possibilities that medicines have. There's a lack of awareness. There are some people, they say, is there a problem? Why regulating medical devices? I don't see any problem. Well, not only low and middle income countries look a bit away sometimes. I mean, if you look at the current stringent regulatory authorities, like Europe and USA, they regulated medical devices 30 years after medicines. And usually there was a problem, there was a disaster. And you might know that in Europe, the breast implant case, the fraud, and the metal on metal hip fueled the discussion on the regulatory system. And there are voices who want the same system as for medicines, for medical devices, which I think is not doable. But what I want to stress here is that accidents, adverse events, fuel, and the discussion, and I would hope that we won't need a disaster before regulating medical devices. When countries start regulating, often it's said there is a pharmacist, so if we take on board medical devices, the pharmacist can do that group as well. I don't think, and I'm a pharmacist by training, as you know, that a pharmacist by default is knowledgeable about medical devices. There is expertise needed, and perhaps you can learn, but you need expertise in regulating medical devices in specific technical issues on medical devices. And of course, there's a lot of lack of resources. Our Asian Harmonization Working Party and WHO in 2003 and GHTF, they already had their models for regulating medical devices. So what's new? We are targeting countries with no or very limited regulation for medical devices in place. We have a two-step approach and we emphasize on market oversight. We strongly believe in convergent harmonizations, reliance and recognition, and I know those terms need definition, but it's about looking across your border for harmonizing and for convergence. And we think that you need specific prerequisites for regulating successfully. And they are also mentioned, called the good regulatory practices. And that's nothing new, in fact, because the OECD in 1997 established a series of principles which you would need for successful regulating of any product. What we're trying to do in our report is also making those specific for medical devices. So we listed a few. You would need for successful regulation of medical device political commitment, a legal framework, a plan, and a regulatory authority with enforcement power. Without enforcement power, without the tools, it's a kind of, well, in Dutch we say paper tiger. I don't know what the expression in English is. And you need, of course, there are those stakeholders out there. The manufacturer, the importers, the authorized representative. They should be involved. They shouldn't be only hearing about it. They should be able and be in the position to have comments and input. And of course, a country can have phases of implementation according to their own priorities. So this is our stepwise approach. The basic level, and I realize the font is very small, but in the pre-market you would need to establish a regulatory framework which can be expanded when you expand your regulatory controls. So what's in there? A definition, the risk classes, the essential principles, reliance, and so on, and the responsibilities of the manufacturer. In the placing on the market, it's the market oversight. So the registration of the establishments, the listing of the devices, and the import controls, the port of entry controls. And in any stage, I think you should have more emphasis on post-market controls, because the pre-market, you can rely or recognize other jurisdictions' decisions. But to have a reporting system in place where people can, where users, healthcare system can report the adverse events, the serious adverse event, the quality problem, and to be able, as a regulator, to act upon that, to withdraw from the market, to delist, is essential, because concentrating on pre-market alone is not sufficient. So this is what we call the à la carte model. So it depends on what you want. Now we are going to fill it. It's not only blank. So these are some of the suggestions we make to regulate in the expanded level. It might not be the clinical trial oversight, but perhaps, and I know that in Saudi Arabia, the in-country inspections were somewhat disappointing in terms of compliance of the establishment once you went out there. So perhaps a country wants to regulate, or the next step in the expanded level would be in-country inspections or emergency provisions. So that depends on the country. We do have some suggestions, but this is the two-step model with the options which we provide. The colors in purple are the colors of which we think please rely upon other initiatives. Don't invent your own definition of a medical device. Don't invent risk classes. Don't invent other essential principles. They are already there, and it would help enormously. The blue ones is the reliance or recognition. And it's not only for low and middle income countries. High income countries like Switzerland and Australia, they have a recognition, a mutual recognition for all the European licensed products. So what we think is that a global model enables the environment, has a possibility of technologies of assured quality reaching the patient, a clear system of regulatory controls, also across borders, and reduces the burdens to regulated industry. And I have to stress here also the use of harmonized norms and standards. ISO is very important, but countries should use the latest version there, because if not, industry has a problem and they are complaining about this. So what are we going to do? We are in the full discussion on the model. We will submit for adoption end of this year by one of the expert committees in WHO. We organize or present our model at regional workshops, and our ambition, although not stated yet, is to organize training workshops on regulating medical devices during the next year. So the ultimate goal is, of course, unsafe medical devices from the market and safe and effective medical devices for all patients all over the world. Thank you very much.